Right, this morning I'm talking with Tommy Cairns from 3%. I've known Tommy over, well, 3 or 4 years now, Tommy, and we've worked together in the healthcare sector. So what we're looking to do is have a little chat with you this morning just to run through on some of our ideas of where we might be looking forward shortly. So, Tommy, first off, importantly, how are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. A bit like everybody else, a little bit uncertain of what to do day to day at the moment, and sort of making the most of whatever work is left. It's pretty slim pickings for the time being, but we're doing okay.
Yeah. And what's it like working at home? I know you go in the office most of the time, don't you? But you've got young children at home or young baby at home. So
as you know, I've got a 6-month-old daughter, so I'm very fortunate. The office is pretty much just me in here, so I can kind of come and go as I please. It's only a minute or two from the house walking wise, so there's it's double edged. It gets me out of the house. It gives me some time to do a little bit of work, but also mentally as well. It's quite nice just to get out, get away from, as lovely as she is, get away from the baby for a couple of hours and whatever, and get on with things I need to. So it's just like everybody else, trying to find a way of making it work. The weekends are difficult because you tend to lose the structure, and I try and stay away from doing too much work-wise at a weekend. So just kind of making it up as we go along, but we're doing okay.
Good. It's the only way to do it, I think. Make it up as you go along. So, yeah. It's the only way.
I built my business on that.
So, Tommy, can we just go through and do a little introduction to 3%? Just sort of talk about what you do and that sort of thing. And I know you've got sort of previous history working at places like Nightingales and places like that. Yeah. And that you we jointly work with an architect in Brighton, which is our RH partnership. So, if you just give us a little talk through.
Yeah, I worked at, they were Nightingale Associates when I joined. I was there for 12, 13 years. And basically just going in as a bit of an admin assistant and graphic designer to begin with. And then over the years, they got taken over, ended up as IBI Group. And I kind of lost faith with, when I joined Nightingales, it was Mike Nightingale's company. And it was very, very design focused, people focused. And I think with a lot of companies, when you get bought out and the priorities sort of shift somewhat towards financial rewards and targets and stuff like that, it wasn't the same company that I joined initially. And I stayed at Chelsea College Interior Design for a little while whilst I was still at Nightingales, and it got to a point, ironically, with hospice work, working at St Wilfrid's. Nightingale Associates, and I was the lead interior designer for St Wilfrid's, but the main architect in charge at St Wilfrid's was RH.
St Wilfrid's is in Woking we're talking about there, aren't we?
No, Wilfrid's is in Eastbourne.
Sorry, Eastbourne.
So that was a new build project, and the main architect was RH Partnership. Obviously, we're aware of now, and we have a ongoing relationship with. So Wilfrid's and Eastbourne. So it was a new build project where I was appointed as the head interior designer as part of Nightingales, but the main architect was RH Partnership, who we're obviously familiar with, and we've worked with numerous occasions since. So it gave me a bit of a safety net, and to go from working for a big corporation to working for myself. The only other real work I had at the time was with residential developers in London, which was just pretty generic specifications for multi-unit developments in around the central London. So I took that opportunity, and so that was 8 years ago. It was 8 years ago in February when I set up on my own. And to be honest, St Wilfrid's was the benchmark, and a lot of that comes down to the quality of the architecture and working with RH and Nick Hall there. But it's become a bit of a go-to. Even inquiries I'm getting now that are generally hospice-based, a lot of people say we want St Wilfrid's. So it's kind of 8 to 10 years on from when we first started on that project. It's as a legacy building, as a reference, I think throughout the UK for hospice care and design development. It's become very, very popular. So since then I work in hospitality, still have a lot of healthcare work, a lot of residential developments. I do some smaller bits and pieces as well. My office is in Towering in Worthing, so there's a lot of footfall around here. So you get people knocking on the door asking about smaller residential refurb and stuff like that. And genuinely, if I can help someone, I will do. But at the moment, my main focus really is on developing probably the larger scale projects and finding a way to help, particularly with healthcare and hospices, finding a way to plug myself into that, so whether it's an estates team or an overall strategy, and kind of hold their hand really, and kind of help them from the very, very start right the way through to completion.
Okay, I think that's a great summary, Tommy. I think, as you say, the legacy of the St Wilfrid's job is that people keep coming back. And I've heard St Wilfrid so many times, anecdotally, in some of the stuff that we've done together. So yeah, I think it talks great testament to the legacy that you have put in there and what comes through. Now, we started together really, we came together over LinkedIn, I think was how we
Yeah.
actually got introduced, Tommy. And with that, we started looking at St Joseph's Hospice up in Hackney.
Yeah.
Now, I think we'd probably describe that as slightly challenging.
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean, the various
we've,
way of putting it. Yeah.
we've, as a company, we've worked in healthcare for more than 10 years doing the stuff for Varian with the cancer treatment bunkers and that sort of thing. So it wasn't necessarily new to us per se, but it was a new experience working in a hospice. And it was great working with yourself because we had someone that we could take the experience off of while also trying to put our processes and our manner of doing things into practice to the benefit of everyone. So can you just briefly describe what St Joseph's was all about? Because you was in there before I was.
Yes, I mean, one of the kind of the things that happens regularly, or seems to happen regularly with hospice work, is that everybody seems to know each other. So, as I said before, off the back of St Wilfrid's and that becoming like a legacy project, you get a lot of people getting in touch, or they do visits of numerous facilities around the south of England or the UK, or whatever, and they kind of cherry pick the facilities or the designs or the styles or whatever it is that they're looking for. And I was called by Woking Hospices probably 5 or 6 years ago now, who'd done that very thing. They travelled around the south of England, they visited St Wilfrid's. They already had an architect in place. So this is sometimes where the dynamic shifts a little bit, where the most successful projects you get plugged in right at the start. Now, from someone like myself, that's not necessarily saying that have me in the master planning stage and I'm a constant point of reference all the way through. Quite often it's some input at that very early stage. So you're working with the architect, you're working with the client to really put together the ideal of what they're trying to achieve. And then quite often I can step back for 6, 9, 12 months, have no input whatsoever, and then come back in again when you actually get into the design and specification stage. With Woking, it was a little bit different because they had their architect in place. They were already on site. When they contacted me, they acknowledged that they were probably a little bit late in the day starting the process. So the chief executive went and met them, did the usual kind of talk with them. One thing that happens a lot is that people say, we want St Wilfrid's. And the start of our conversation is, well, you don't want St Wilfrid's, you want your interpretation of that. I think you probably understand as well as I do now that every hospice is very, very different. They're usually a reflection of their CEO, but also a reflection of the demographic, the area where they're situated and they're located. So we went through that process of meeting Woking, understanding what their needs were, and working around the plans and everything that had been signed off to date and was already in place. There was a little bit of upheaval there where the chief exec changed. So the temporary management team that came in place had slightly different ideas again. So over a period of probably 18 months to 2 years, the project shifted quite significantly. And as a business plugged in alongside that, you kind of adapt accordingly and you do what you can to make it work. So off the back of that, the chief executive took up a position at St Joseph's, had that same kind of phone call. Can you come and do what you've done before? So go to the meet and greet. St Joseph's was a bit of a steep learning curve in terms of every hospice I'd worked on previously. There was a lot of familiarity with how the estates were run and what their overall strategies were, how they were funded, how they took on these kind of projects. And St Joseph's, due to the scale of it, the size of it, and the location, was very, very different. So having that tagged on alongside that, what initially was a very light refurbishment brief, where you're talking about wall coverings, floor coverings, new furniture, lighting, bits and pieces like this, so a very, very light touch, became a lot more involved, as well, in terms of the potential to add additional bed space and single occupancy rooms and en suites and all the M&E associated queries and stuff that come alongside that. So things shifted from a basic spec writing project to something a lot more involved, which is one of the reasons at the time why I contacted yourselves and the likes of Fatkin as well, because the project was moving along so quickly. The requirement was, from my point of view, was to have people in place that could help, that could meet the client, but also you knew you could trust. I think we were at a stage at that where the client, it became very apparent the client needed help and needed some proper support. And for me to be able to kind of push that forward and advance that, then the people around me, I had to be able to trust as well. So although we hadn't worked together, I knew you through local football, through your involvement with Wedding Football Club and things like this. I knew through LinkedIn historically the kind of projects you worked on, the kind of person you were. So there's that element of comfort saying, okay, well, and also to challenge the norm in terms of, having specific healthcare QSs or project management teams in place. Now, there's that learning curve, but you have that healthcare background anyway, but also it's bringing that kind of that commercial acumen to it as well, in terms of if decisions have to be made, you're willing to make them. You can't, as nice as a lot of the groups are, and particularly with hospices, the staff and the management they're very, very different, very, very different to normal, what you would class as
I read something over the weekend, and it hit home with me a little bit, in that someone was sort of describing what we do and how to change things and how you work with things and that sort of thing. And they described it as a surgical procedure. And it's like the surgeon going in, he's had many, many years training and very much a lot of experience. And the first thing he does is, by the time he washes his hands, that then sets into place a sort of chain of events and actions that need to go through to get to the end of a project, end of a procedure in what he's doing. And ours is very much similar to that. We go in at that start, and it's a process, and no matter what the actual sort of subject, if you like, whether it be hospitality or whether it would be healthcare or it would be office or whatever else in what we do, the process is always the same. And it's almost us starting to wash our hands at the start means that we come through that process all the way through to the very end to get the result that you're really looking for, and apply those processes and those methods and experience.
Yeah, but at the same time, there's always that element of flexibility as well, in that and this is, I've learned a lot over the last 8 to 10 years, and a lot of it the hard way, is that no two jobs are the same. And hospices always look very familiar on the outside. The initial brief, the initial chat is always pretty consistent in terms of, they talk about hotel feels and making people feel like it's, they're at home and all this kind of stuff. And that's the challenge. It's interesting in terms of a starting point. I always consider that I work with the client rather than for them. So initially it's about getting to understand, again, not just the staff, not just the management team, but understanding the demographic. You're very familiar yourself with Hackney in terms of the day-to-day usage, in terms of different religions, different different levels of wealth and this kind of thing. It's a real mixed bag, and I think that's the strength of the hospice in terms of how it feels when you're there. But also it's one of the challenges as well, because it's not just a leafy suburb where everybody's expectations are the same. You've got big family groups coming to visit the site and stuff like that. So it's really trying to make sure that you're not just going through the motions. You're not just ticking boxes. You have to stick. If you lose that process, if you lose that way of working, everything will fall apart. But you've got to be flexible enough to adapt and to amend, and to make sure really you're giving the client what they need rather than what you want to give them. So it's kind of a bit of a juggling act.
No, I love your empathy and I love your enthusiasm, Tommy. That's why I just sit back and listen. I can listen to you all day talking, because it builds and it really comes between.
It is difficult because a lot of healthcare work. I've worked on an NHS project this year, which was the first one I've worked on for probably since I left Nightingale's, and I swore for a time I would never do an NHS project again, because of it felt like the bureaucracy and the way that the projects were set up, and the constant reviews, and I've lost out. I've stepped away from hospice work before as well, where if perhaps a design and build contract and the setup of the framework of the project itself, if I didn't feel like I'd fit in that, I would be better off walking away rather than committing to something where I didn't feel I'd be able to contribute in the best way possible. I always consider that the hospice is my client, no matter how the contract's set up, no matter who I report to, and I'm quite open and honest about that, is that I work for the benefit of the hospice. And that's not about spending more money or spending more time. It's just about making sure the money that is spent and the time that I spend on the project is worthwhile and it's in the right areas. And that's one of the reasons why I left Nightingale's, one of the reasons why I sort of set up on my own. And one of the reasons it's been so hard to learn over the last 8 years about, I've made considerable mistakes in terms of time and budgets and fees and stuff like that. But it's always been for the benefit of the client rather than the benefit of myself or anybody else that's part of the design team. So I think, yeah, you learn the hard way, but I think from a personal point of view, it's the right way generally of approaching those kind of projects.
From a way of working, I really enjoy working with you on jobs, and that enthusiasm and everything else, as I say, going into the job, it really helps put everything in perspective as well, and it gives us a lot more enjoyment. It's not just purely money driven. We're there to get best value, and we're there to get the best process, and that sort of thing. But it makes that process so much more enjoyable. So
I think also, as well as, you know, there are times in these projects where there is very little enjoyment when you get to the nitty gritty and you have the problems. But if you feel that everyone working on that project team is like-minded and coming from a similar starting point, then you can have that conversation. And sometimes it's just a sounding board. You know, you can speak to yourself, you speak to FAC, IWA, and you might have a bit of a vent and a rant at the way things are. But everybody was, it sounds really cliche, but everyone really was pulling in the same direction. Everybody wanted to complete the project to the best of their ability and to the highest level possible. And that isn't always the case. You know, you have different subcontractors, different design input, different elements, and they're all pulling in different directions. It makes things very difficult. You can't have those conversations because everybody wants to keep the larger slice of the pie for themselves. So I think just having that openness, and that was all set up before we actually started. You know, we'd had those conversations. We knew where we were coming from. We knew it was going to be challenging. But the fact that, yeah, as difficult as it got at times, there was empathy for other people. You know, everybody was kind of, very much pulling in the same direction.
But in reality, we started off looking at one ward, which was on the first floor. We ended up doing the one on the second floor. And sorry, Tommy.
Yeah, from a project point of view, this is where, again, something else we've learned and something we've talked about since with other hospices is really trying to understand the client's long-term objective and how robust their own estate's management is. And it sounds really patronizing. When you go into some organizations, and it's belt and braces, all of the historical documentation, whether it's drawings, fire surveys, strategies, estates management, all this kind of stuff is all laid out, ready to go. They know everything they need to know about the building. And you kind of take that sometimes as a given, where I think now we're realizing that, different organizations, different hospices, different coming away from healthcare, just different businesses operate in different ways. And you can't take anything for granted in that sense. As I say, it was very much, I was approached about a light touch approach to a single ward. And within 2 or 3 months, that had changed completely. So we had to adapt along the way. I think if we're honest, there probably could have been more questions asked at certain stages, but the way things were with the budget and the financial years and the way the client wanted to move forward, you kind of go with that and you do your best to adapt and change. And for a long while, we were felt we were ahead of the game. And it was just, certain challenges at certain points that made it very, very difficult. And then going forward, that's a lesson learned, that the next time around. And I think, we went we've been to hospices since, so we've had that conversation with them. But before you start talking about figures and pulling the trigger on this, make sure your estates is fully in line with where you expect it to be and where your subcontractors and your clients expect it to be. And I think in the long term, it will just help smooth the process out a little bit and make sure everybody's ready to go at the start.
I think as a project team, though, we did actually take ownership of the job and really took ownership of the job and helped deliver what we actually put through. So as I say, we ended up doing what was originally called Lord's Ward and pushed that through. And it was slightly different to probably what we originally tendered. And we had to renegotiate based on revised measures and that sort of thing, based on what we were looking with St Michael's Ward. But ultimately, we got a result there. I think we got a good result that come through. And the difference for me is when you look at those start and finish photos, and that start photo is very bland, it's very yellowy, it's very sort of old looking. And then the freshness of what you've got going forwards and how that compares, and also just walking between the different wards there now. When you walk up and down the stairs, you can see that difference, and you can see the great enjoyment or appreciation, rather, that you've actually got with the nursing staff as well.
I think that's the key to it, is that I'm very rarely get to the end of a project and look back at it and don't think, oh, maybe we could have done this, maybe we could have done that. But that's just the way, as a business, I tend to run in terms of challenging yourself to make sure you're constant betterment, constantly trying to do the right thing. And there probably was an element of what might have been when you look at award in terms of, perhaps what could have been achieved. But then you do speak to the staff and you get the feedback from inpatients, day patients and families, and the difference it makes to them on a day-to-day basis. And then you've got to come away from a project like that with some semblance of reality that we achieved more than probably we should have done. I think that's the most important thing now when I look back, is that that there could have been times where things grind to a halt, but we wouldn't have got to the level we did do. I mean, and it's not just about being CQC compliant, it's about creating an environment, again, that's for the betterment. And the staff often tend to get forgotten about. And it's interesting how things have shifted over the last couple of months with the current pandemic, and the focus on the NHS and the staff in particular is that, I've been worked on developing hospice projects before, and being asked to kind of grade where sort of a standing level for patients, for visitors, for staff, for kind of like a hierarchy. And I've never been able to find that ability to be able to separate them, because I don't see the need for it. That just because you're not going to spend X amount of the budget on staffing needs doesn't mean you give their considerations any less thought. I think that's really important. I think that's one thing, again, from St Joseph's that's really stood out, is that, as much as I might walk away with a little bit something, well, perhaps could have done a little bit more, could have been a better finish. When you speak to the staff and the difference it's made to them, they are there 7 days a week, 24 hours a day. It's kind of that's really, really important, that they can come into work every day and they feel valued as much as as everybody else does. So it was a very, very, very challenging project.
What I also appreciate is in some ways they're asking favours, but they're coming back to us as well now as a team to look onwards, hopefully to do some more with them. Also, things like they want their cafe looked at. They know that we work in cafes. We're going to help them. And I think that's the first time as a hospice that they've actually gone back to the same design team or constituents of it in the history that I've seen of it. And that's possibly why we had such a problem in terms of record drawings and things like that in the first place, in terms of there's been so many inputs that they've never gone back to. But they've bought into what we've done. And, I think that's big volumes for what you did to set up in the first place, Tommy.
Well, it's usually one of the first questions I ask any client is why me, why us? If particularly for sometimes with a new build, that they haven't got that kind of legacy of subcontractors and contractors and consultants. But with refurbishment work within states like the size of St Joseph's, the first question was, well, if you've had the reception been done 3 or 4 years earlier and it looked to a really nice standard, really nice level, it was well finished, is why are you starting again? Why is there a new person coming in? What's happened to the kind of leg? And there was never really an answer for that. And I think that was just historically how things are developed with their senior management team and the way the estates are developed, that nothing was linked together. Everything was kind of ad hoc. There's a little project going on here and a project going on there, and I'm not saying everything has to be joined up and linked together, but there was no continuity whatsoever. So yeah, and I think that's an important thing now in terms of how we work, is that when we finish on a project, it's not just about drawing a line in the sand and walking away and leaving them with nothing. That the suppliers you use, like people like Lit Medical, who were an absolute godsend, who I'd never worked with before, and Gary Hudson and his team, is that once you get to work with a company like that in that kind of environment, in that situation, there's that go-to. And I'll speak to other hospices now and say, look, you might not need me, you might not need X number of weeks of input, but if you're looking at someone to work with your trunking or your joinery items, speak to Lit Medical. That's not to say you go and use them, but speak to them, get them to price it, get them to talk you through what you need. And it feels like you're leaving the client in good hands. It's not just finishing the project off, walking away, and then on to the next one, you forget about things. And I think one of the strengths over the years has been going back to a lot of these clients and 6 months, 12 months, 18 months later, finding out what has worked, what hasn't worked. St Joseph's produced a really good list for us about, in the turn of year, probably in January, where things that have worked and things that haven't worked, and the wars, as a critique looking at projects going forward. And the majority of the issues they've had weren't anything to do with our refurbishment. It was
No.
purely from a practical
Practical operation.
exactly, yeah. So it was something that perhaps we could adapt the spec to suit, but there was nothing that we could have done from a design point of view to have provided them with anything better than what we could have done. I mean, I think the only criticism I have with myself is that some of the aesthetics, some of the colours, the wallpapers, which is the last thing to go in a project, and they're always at risk of going wrong because the nature of the projects.
I think you're being hard on yourself there, though, and actually, that's something I'd actually really like to actually talk about. Is in terms of what you've done and where I've seen it in supplying those sort of materials, which are CQC compliant, but they give a little bit more of that, not hotel room, but that homely feel in there. It's not all just white walls. And
yeah, I mean, it's something we're going to, again, we talk about a lot at the start of projects, and that the general approach from hospices seems to be they always seem to talk about boutique hotel, which I understand exactly where they're coming from, but more often than not, that's not actually what they want. You don't want anything too shiny, too clinical. What they want is something that makes people feel comfortable. And I've always said that I don't get any satisfaction of someone walking into a patient's ensuite room after it's complete and go, this is beautiful. It's not the point of it. And like I said to you before, the point is, my point of view is that whoever goes into that room immediately feels as comfortable as they possibly can. And part of that comes down to how you approach a project. There's obviously a lot of legislation, CQC and HTM, HBN compliance, you've got to look along the way. Is that if you start with those as your reference point to begin with, and you head towards the middle, I tend to come from the other direction in terms of really speaking to the client. What do you want? How do you want it to feel? How do you want, what kind of environment you're trying to create? And then make sure that works in a compliant manner. And although you both end up in the middle, that starting point's really important, because you generally you're trying to make these spaces as non-clinical as possible. And the way things have advanced with manufacturing techniques and materials, and the supply of joinery items that don't look clinical or healthcare like anymore, you can create something that takes you out of that healthcare bubble. One of the biggest ones for me was when I was finishing St Wilfrid's. I stayed on after the project to do some artwork installation. So I worked with some of the day patient groups in terms of producing artwork and hanging it. When we did one installation, I took my nephew. He would have been probably 14, 15 at the time. Never been to hospice before. Took him along. We went on the train, took all the bits and pieces, did all the work, and he was fine, absolutely fine. He was comfortable in the environment. We were in the day spaces. And about half an hour before we were due to leave, one of the staff came round and asked if we were okay. He said, yes. He said, well, just to let you know, we've lost a patient on the wing. The undertaker will be coming in the next sort of 20 minutes or so. Are you okay? I said, yeah, that's fine, but we're nearly done here. And I just remember looking and seeing the look on my nephew's eyes, because that was the first time in the 2 or 3 hours we've been there, the realization was of where he actually was, that kind of environment and kind of the acute nature of it. So it was interesting talking to him now about that, in terms of, his having never been to a hospice before, his initial reaction walking into the space and, seeing the people, it didn't feel like a healthcare environment. It didn't feel like, palliative care. It didn't feel like end of life care. And that's completely different to my introduction to hospice growing up with family members, where St Barnabas, the old St Barnabas in Worthing, going in there with grandparents, stuff like that. It was a very different experience. It was very, very clinical, very cold, and as lovely and as warm as the staff were. Where we're at now in terms of design and what we're providing these organisations it's kind of night and day. So all of those things over the years, they kind of like drip feeding little bits of knowledge that you take on to the next one and you pass that on.
I think it's giving a human face to that healthcare, and it's giving something that I'm not saying it is a hotel room. I'm not saying it's big and shiny, but what it actually is, there is a level of comfort in there, and there is a TV, and there's colour.
Yeah.
My perception walking in, and certainly to start with at St Joseph's, it was all very yellow, and others that I've visited are all very yellow, magnolia. They're all those sort of colours. Whereas what we've actually done is we've introduced that little bit of colour, and with that, it does not take the edge off it, but it softens it.
I think it does. I think it's how you introduce it as well. In that it's probably just part of how taste and style changes anyway. And when I first started at Nightingale's, that colour palette could last for 2 or 3 years. Nowadays, it feels like it's 2 or 3 months. That public are pushing for more and more and more and faster turnover. So we make sure as best as possible that when we are adding colour and anything that's, you know, relatively modern, that it's in areas where, you know, like curtains have a certain lifespan. They will last you a few years. So you can afford to introduce some strong colour or some identity there, with the knowledge that in time they'll be replaced, so you can refresh it. But things like the walls and the heavy duty joinery and the fixtures and fittings, you try and make them, you know, generally relatively neutral, so you get a comfortable feel for it. But you can change the bed throws, you can change the cushions, you can add artwork, you know, just framed artwork to the wall spaces and stuff like this, and keep things fresh, keep things new, and not just from a patient point of view, again from a staffing point of view. So, you know, they take ownership of the spaces, and they feel like they, you know, there's that encouragement every day to go in there and feel like they're being respected in terms of, yeah, what the buildings provide for them.
And sort of taking a step back is, you know, what I'd like to do is just have a very brief look at sort of funding and how we work through that with you, because on St Joseph's was quite an interesting route, if you like, and with that I think I learned a lot. And I think if we can sort of just briefly discuss how that sort of went together, and how you see this sort of post pandemic, you know, what might change if the government does come through and says that they're going to write off all the NHS debt. Great.
Yeah.
I don't personally believe it all, but that would be great. Let's take politics aside, but looking at the wards that we did for St Joseph's, or ward that we've done for St Joseph's so far, you know, I think that was quite cost effective. But what we've got to remember is most of that funding has come from donations, and it's how we can actually plan a campaign, if you like, to actually go out and actually achieve that funding that allows us then to go and do those works.
Yeah, I think again that's always going to be very difficult, because what works for one hospice won't work for another. You know, like I said, you know, we are relatively fortunate where we are in Worthing and St Barnabas in terms of, you know, there's a very sort of generous local public. You know, there's a lot of going on all the time. Hackney's a very challenging environment. And there are plenty of other boroughs and areas in a similar situation. So I think really, as far as from a budgeting point of view, it's been able to give the hospices, give the clients with some semblance of accuracy an idea of what it's going to cost them. You know, I think that's the important thing. That the fundraising thing, I don't know how it's going to work from going forward. I mean, a lot of these hospices still have an element of NHS funding, but they're still reliant on fundraising, and I don't think any of us know really how that's going to go, how that's going to change going forward. People are being incredibly generous at the moment. You know, we've seen all the NHS funding drives going on at the moment, and how much money has been raised. But that can't go on forever. People haven't got bottomless pockets. It can't just, we can't be constantly relying on the public to fund these things. So
well, in reality, that anything that's going into the NHS now has probably been diverted for something else before. I say new money. It's a divergence from something else. So what you'll find is one charity that would have benefited before probably is missing out at the moment.
Yeah.
And then the NHS charities are gaining.
And also, even some of the organisations that are part funded by the NHS, in terms of what their plans were 6 months ago, you know, in terms of what they've had to do in terms of emergency services, whether it's, you know, through staffing, through upgrading equipment and CQC kind, or whatever it might be on site. You know, if you're taking 20, 30, 40 grand away from a pot that's been designated for some, you know, a refurbishment of a ward, or refurbishment of an education area, and all of a sudden that money's been, you know, had to go to sort of emergency cover for whatever reason, then that's take a long time to get that kind of money back. I was working on 3 healthcare projects leading into the lockdown that have all been put on hold. And you don't know if, I mean, I'm not concerned from a business point of view, but from a client point of view, they don't really know with any certainty when they come back. And I think that's going to be the case for months or years, that people have to come out and find their feet again and find out where they are, and make some more tough decisions. I mean, that always seems to be the case for the last 10 years, that every time you speak to clients, they're having to make tough decisions because of funding cuts and issues with staffing and things like that. So I do have some concerns that, you know, some of the private sector might cherry pick certain areas and make the most of it. But that's, you know, that's out of my control. That's not really something to say probably too political to
But
get
in
to
terms of funding, we're able to work with you, and we can price up a room, or we can price up a ward, or we can price up a whole hospice even.
I think that's
Knowing what we've done before and using our experience and knowledge of what we've got going in there, we're able to do that with you, and we can help them then predict what they're doing going forwards.
and that's the key thing, is that it's not just about, you know, planning for an £8 million new build. It's, you know, we talked about with hospices about refurbishing chapel areas and things like this. It can be everything from a single room through to the master plan development of a whole new site, or even securing a new site for someone. So it's been able to put yourself in, and again, it's that trust and being able to put yourself in front of the client at the right stage, to provide them with the information, the answers they need to be able to plan effectively going forward. That if someone tells them it's going to be, you know, £7 million to do X, Y, Z, that's what it's going to cost. And there's some certainty with that, because, you know, fundraising is hard enough as it is, let alone to get to a stage where you end up on site and having to find another 500,000 or the million, wherever it is. And that pressure automatically then goes back to the public, because the fund, you know, I've had this on numerous projects where you've almost got your toe over the line, and then there's a shortfall of however many 100,000, and there's that plea going out. I think, again, in terms of accountability for our place in that chain as well, it's making sure you offer value for your services. You know, if you're looking at, you know, if you look at, for example, my fee on a multi-million-pound project, it's a drop in the ocean. It really is. It's kind of, if someone like, not just me, if someone like myself is used in the right way, you get tremendous added value from that, because you can save on your material costs through, you know, challenging supply chains and challenging main contractors in terms of how much they are charging that client for their flooring or their wall coverings or their furniture, whatever it is, and making sure there's some accountability. More often than not nowadays, not just in healthcare, but projects in general, going in late, I will save the client money above and beyond what my fees are, just by taking, you know, a pragmatic approach to it and trying to do the right things. So I think, again, from our point of view going forward, the idea would be to hopefully get to meet the clients at the right time, even before they're talking about doing their refurbishment, you know, moving sites, and, you know, being able to provide them with a good idea of what the costs are going to be, what the timescales involved are going to be, who they need to have involved at these certain stages to make sure it works properly, and take St Wilfrid as your benchmark in terms of a design team and a strategy, but also in terms of how the client and hospice themselves carried themselves throughout the process, how prepared they were, but also how they saw themselves through the project, you know, in terms of their ongoing involvement. And it wasn't just a case of we hand over the keys at the end and we walk away. It's, okay, well, how are we going to use these spaces in a year's time, in 2 years' time, in 5 years' time? So it's that kind of, again, it sounds really cliched and kind of over the top, but it's kind of, yeah, that synergy of really having an idea from start to finish of how it's going to work, and it not being a money grab. You know, that I think that's probably the thing I've seen with NHS over the years, is that kind of once you get yourself on a supply chain, where it's like just take. Once you're in there, you kind of job done, earn the fee, move on. And I think particularly with the hospice work, there's a lot more involvement required than that.
That's great. I think we've had a really good chat. You know, it's I think as we've gone through, we've gone through different stages and that sort of thing. One thing I would say is, as I say, it's a great empathy that you display through what you're doing, Tommy, that gets other people to buy in. So that helped me buy in the first place, and I'm right there for it. And I think we've had that working relationship together, that we can sit together and actually plan that for different hospices and areas. You know, we've got the healthcare experience in other areas, but specifically towards hospice sort of care and that sort of thing, I think, you know, we can come with an experienced team, and we've got other people that we can advocate and work with and utilize to actually add to that team as and when we need to. So I think
that's the thing that we've talked about maybe over the last sort of 6 months or so, is that this isn't about going out and winning work for yourself. It's you know, it is genuinely, it is bigger than that. It's the ability to go out and say, you know, I meet clients all the time now where you kind of get the feeling that you probably don't need me. You know, there's no point in, you know, paying me for 2 weeks, a month, 6 months worth of work if you don't really need to be there. But speak to these guys, speak to you know, this lady who works for a furniture supplier, or speak to someone like yourself, or, you know, Fiona and Dan. In fact, you know, speak to them. You know, really kind of target, you know, the information that you need, rather than kind of, and it's the thing, there's a lot of, despite the size and scale of some of these hospices, that doesn't necessarily equate to them having the right people on board to guide them through the whole process. And if you're not involved sometimes early enough, you feel that key decisions get missed out. And I think if you can plug the right people in at the very start to give you that right advice, whether you stick with them or you move away down a different route, at least the starting point's the right position for them. So I think as we've discussed, I think that's probably what we try and do more than anything, is to try and set these organisations on the right path.
Yeah, and I think that's the message overall. We're here to help. We're not here to scratch money and everything else. We're here to help, and we've got a team that's big enough to work around with us as well, and care and put in the right services in the right places.
I think
I'd like to come away from this discussion with that message. Really, we're just here to help.
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, fundamentally, that's what we, both of us have been sort of shouting about over the last 3 or 4 years working on this, and the fact that people don't always believe you. That's quite important. It sort of resonates as well, that you can say it, but it takes to go through something like St. Joseph's and come out the other side, and for a client to then come to you and say, well, actually, you were right. We appreciate what you've done. We appreciate you sticking by us. That's kind of takes away. We said before that walking away from that project or getting to end that project was a relief at some point, but to get into that position where we will now go back and we are happy to help them, and they're obviously very, very grateful for the time and the effort we put in there, then I can live with some of the aesthetics perhaps not being quite what I'd hoped for, but we've achieved really what you set out to achieve.
And ultimately, I think that's been a great chat, Tommy, coming through. I thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully we can give this out to the people that are listening and watching, and go and help some more. So thank you very much, Tommy.
It's been my pleasure. Cheers, Julian. Thanks so much.
Thank you.